Laws and guidance. Topics to be covered in this module. History of child protection in the UK. The Victoria Climate Inquiry. Peter Connolly and working together. Child protection system in England. The Children Act. Policy and guidance. Other legislation. Summary. History of child protection in the UK. You might find it surprising to realize that child protection as we know it today was not something that children of our fairly recent past had access to. The mid to late 19th century. Back in the mid to late 19th century, there was no child protection in place. The only form of child protection, which was rare, came from the church or from one or two well-meaning people. To make matters worse, back then, society never considered that children were abused. Child labor was common. Schooling was inadequate. Child labor and neglect were accepted. It was not socially acceptable to interfere with other families. Child mortality was high. The beginning of child protection legislation. Surprisingly, the first changes concerning child protection were not concerning any form of abuse. Instead, philanthropists focused on limiting working hours for children who worked in mines, factories and chimneys. It seems inadequate now, and it is. But this was the turning point. From here, society's perception began to change, as they began to understand that it was not good for children to be working for long hours in extreme conditions. First laws were implemented to protect children from harsh working conditions. The late 19th century to the mid-20th century. This period saw two significant changes. The formation of child protection societies. Society's perspective on child protection begins to change. The case of Mary Ellen. A significant case in the history of child protection is that of a 10-year-old girl, Mary Ellen from the USA. Mary Ellen, born in 1864, found herself in the hands of the Department of Charities after the death of her father. Her mother had no other option but to send her to be adopted because she now had to work and couldn't afford to pay for a carer. Tragically, Mary Ellen experienced continuous neglect and physical abuse at the hands of her carers. Fortunately, Mary Ellen's neighbors became aware of Mary Ellen's abuse and spoke out on her behalf. They made contact with a mission worker named Etta Wheeler and eventually made contact with a gentleman named Henry Berg. It would be Henry who would begin to push for change. Henry, who had previously founded the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was now fighting to help Mary Ellen, and he succeeded. Some legislation was put in place to help Mary Ellen, and Henry founded the first Child Protection Society in 1875. This name of this society was the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Pause for thought. Henry was not only a huge influence back then, but anybody involved in safeguarding children should remember Henry's sense of humanity, compassion and direct action. They are still relevant examples of how we should approach safeguarding children today. We should not leave any stone or hunch unturned. Unsafe children depend on us not to. The impact of Mary Ellen's case. Mary Ellen's case was a catalyst for further change closer to home too. Thomas Agnew followed in Henry's footsteps in 1883 after visiting the USA. On his return, he set up the first Child Protection Society right here in the UK. It was a local society for the prevention of cruelty to children, based in Liverpool. In 1889 the Liverpool Society aligned with a similar London society which became the NSPCC. Note: NSPCC stands for the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The NSPCC was active in the future changes to legislation and societal attitudes towards children in need. Their efforts came to fruition in the Children's Charter. From the mid to late 19th century to today. The year 1889 saw the first Act of Parliament in the UK to protect children. The conditions of this legislation meant that interventions could be made, by law, between parents and their children, and that anybody who mistreats a child could be arrested. From this point onwards, there has been a steady progression of laws and legislation, all designed to protect the safety and well-being of children. As you might imagine, child abuse and child protection is a complex matter, which is why there is so much legislation in place today. You will come to see that most of the changes made in child protection today follow in the footsteps of the case of Mary Ellen. They react to a tragic case of child neglect or abuse. The cases that change legislation and policy serve as examples of what can happen if we do not take action. They also help authorities to amend the legislation to prevent any similar cases in the future. Even to this day, there are still and will continue to be cases that change the way we view and manage child protection. You will learn more about some of these cases as we progress through this course. The Victoria Climie Inquiry. Victoria Climie was an 8-year-old girl who suffered greatly at the hands of her carers. During the 10 months she lived in the UK, she was tied up in a black plastic bag in the bath full of her excrement for over 24 hours. Forced to eat cold food like a dog. Burnt with cigarettes. Hit with bike chains, hammers and wires. Scalded. Victoria's post-mortem revealed 128 separate injuries. These were bad enough, but Victoria was known to the authorities. There were opportunities for somebody to save her, but nobody did. Victoria and her carer had been known to 3+ housing authorities, 4 social care departments, GP surgeries, 2 hospitals. What went wrong? There were at least 12 opportunities for authorities to save Victoria, but they were missed. Some of the issues found in the authorities involved in Victoria's case and described in the Laming Report, 2003, were organizational failures, unclear responsibility at multiple levels, consistent absence of good practice, under-resourced, unallocated child-in-need cases, understaffed, undermanaged and dysfunctional social care departments, lack of communication between departments and authorities. The Government Green Paper Every Child Matters, 2003, and the Children Act, 2004 followed the Laming Report to ensure that actions are taken to ensure all issues highlighted in the Laming Report were corrected and that a case like Victoria's never slips through the net again. We look at Every Child Matters in more detail further on in this module. Peter Connolly and working together. If Victoria's case was not enough, another case followed fairly soon after in 2007. Another child, Peter Connolly, died when he was only 17 months old. Injuries he sustained were broken back, broken ribs, over 50 injuries at the time of his death. Peter's mother, his mother's boyfriend and the boyfriend's brother were later convicted for their roles in harming Peter. There were some similarities to Victoria Climie's case. Peter was known to many agencies and authorities. He was subject to a child protection plan for physical abuse and neglect, and he was seen by a community pediatrician for a developmental assessment the day before, where physical abuse with extensive injuries was most likely undetected. Peter lived the London borough of Haringey, the same area as Victoria, which means that the same authorities had once again let a child slip through the system. Following Peter's death, Lord Laming wrote a new report, The Protection of Children in England, a Progress Report, 2009. In this report, Lord Laming re-emphasized his previous recommendation, which included multi-agency working, the importance of leadership, accountability and responsibility, collaboration up to government level, the establishment of the National Safeguarding Delivery Unit, 2009. Since Peter's death, new statutory guidance has been published, Working Together to Safeguard Children, 2010, updated in 2013. We take a look at the key features of working together to safeguard children further on in this module. The child protection system in England. There is an organised system for child protection in the UK. However, each UK nation is responsible for most aspects of safeguarding and child protection. You can find up-to-date and specific details about each UK nation's guidelines and policies concerning child protection by visiting the NSPCC website. You can click here if you want to take a look. NSPCC. In general, for all nations, the principles are similar. Laws are passed to prevent harm to children and guidelines are created to show agencies and organizations what they need to do to maintain the safety of children. Laws are passed to ward off harm from children by providing the actions that are required. The guidance sets out what organizations and agencies should do to play their part to keep children safe. Much of the legislation featured in this module will follow similar principles across all nations. The Children Act. The primary function of the Children Act is to allocate duties and obligations to agencies, authorities, courts and parents concerning the safeguarding and welfare of children. The central theme running through the Children Act is that children are better off with their families. Though if a family is unable to cooperate with the legislation and compromise the well-being of children, there are provisions included in the Children Act to support that issue. The critical points for both versions of the Children Act are: the Children Act 1989. The welfare of the child is paramount. Delay is likely to prejudice the welfare of the child. The court shall not make an order unless to do so would be better for the child than making no order, the no order principle. The Children Act 2004. After the death of Victoria Climie, the Children Act 1989 was revised. The new revisions feature in the Children Act 2004. These revisions do not replace any aspect of the Children Act 1989. Instead, there are additional requirements, such as: it created the post of Children's Commissioner for England. It has placed a duty on local authorities to appoint a Director of Children's Services who is accountable for the delivery of services. Also, it has placed a duty on local authorities and their partners to cooperate in promoting the well-being of children and making arrangements to safeguard and promote the welfare of children at all times. Children and Social Work Act 2017. This act follows a program of suggested reforms laid out in a policy paper called Putting Children First, Our Vision for Children's Social Care. This policy focuses on the promotion of the safeguarding of children already in the care system. It also covers new legislation relating to the provision of relationship and sex education. The key points for this act are: the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel was established to review and report on serious child protection cases that are complex or of national importance. Child death review partners are required to review each death of a child normally resident in their area and identify matters that are relevant to children locally. Local authorities must appoint personal advisors for care leavers up to the age of 25. Relationships education will be provided to primary school.